Hello Uriel. Community. I'm a big fan of the show. I always listen to it at work. It has become a routine to have the stories playing in the background while I do my activities, even if they are unrelated. I want to share with you a story that happened to me when I was in middle school. I don't remember exactly the night it all began. I only remember that it was a very cold night, and it was 3 in the morning. I woke up startled by the sound of pebbles hitting my window. The sound was constant and annoying. Then I heard a whisper coming from an old, very large tree that could be seen from my bedroom window. At first, I even thought it could be pranks from some neighbor. There were many children on that street, and they sometimes played outside until very late. But I soon realized it was something else. At that same time, the neighbor's dog started howling in a disturbing way, as if they sensed something strange, as if something terrified them. That first night I tried to ignore it, but the situation repeated itself every early morning. From then on, my older brother Julia slept in the room next door, and one night she told me she had heard a kind of fluttering, very loud on the roof, followed by horrible sounds, almost inhuman voices. Things got worse when one day, returning from school, I saw the highest branches of the old tree moving very abruptly, as if there was something very heavy in it. I looked closely, and there among the branches, I saw a naked woman with very long and messy hair. She looked directly into my eyes. I could feel a chill run through me. And suddenly, in the blink of an eye, that woman was no longer there. There was a kind of very large bird, the size of a person, that didn't look like any animal I had ever seen before. That thing, whatever it was, flew away. From that night on, I was terrified to look out the window, because every time I did, I saw that same thing, that strange bird, hidden among the branches of the tree, with those huge bright eyes that wouldn't stop staring at me. My health began to deteriorate. I felt weaker and weaker, without energy. My hair started falling out, and emotionally, I was very bad. I felt a deep sadness and constant anxiety, permanent. One day while crossing the streets, returning from school to home, a car hit me. It wasn't a strong hit, but enough for me to be in pain for more than a week, preventing me from going to school. The most disturbing thing is that at the moment of the accident, I was in shock, and I can swear that I saw that woman I had seen in the tree, this time dressed in a very old and dark dress, looking at me from across the street, poking her head out, hidden behind a wall. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I decided to tell my mom what was happening. She was very worried and suggested we call my grandmother. She was a kind of healer, but we didn't have a great relationship with her for the same reason, because my mom was always a bit afraid of her. My grandmother, upon hearing my story, told me it was probably a witch, something very different from what she was, something evil. She told me that she had set her eye on me for some reason. Maybe I had unknowingly passed by where she lived, or because I had done something that offended her. My grandmother asked me to recite the prayer of the Magnificent. Apparently, it's a very powerful prayer against witches. She also gave me other advice, like putting open scissors under my pillow, sprinkling salt in the corners of my room, and lighting blessed candles at night. Julia, my sister, also followed the advice and put scissors under her pillow. Despite following all the advice, the presence of that bird remained constant. My health was going from bad to worse. Finally, my grandmother suggested that I spend a night at her house to perform a more complete ritual. That night, my grandmother prepared an herbal bath for me, of which I only recognized rue, rosemary, and basil. While I bathed, we recited the Magnificent and other protection prayers. My grandmother sat in front of an altar She had lit copal and asked for protection from some saint, I guess. My mom and my sister Julia, from home, were also praying and watching the window. From that night on, the whisper and the knocks on the window ceased. The neighbor's dogs stopped howling, and the atmosphere in my house returned to normal. The next day I returned home, finally feeling free from the disturbing presence and much better in health. Since then, the nights have become peaceful again. My grandmother's protection somehow managed to scare away the witch that was harassing me. Over time, I stopped thinking about what had happened, and as I grew up, I even forgot about it. But a few days ago, I was near my old house, and out of nostalgia decided to pass by that street to see it. That same night when I returned to my current apartment, something woke me up at 3 in the morning. Sounds of small stones hitting my window, and almost imperceptible whispers coming from there, from the glass. That seems quite strange to me because I live in a building, because my apartment is on the 5th floor. I just hope I haven't brought the old witch to my current home, especially now that my grandmother is no longer here to protect me. It was one of those early mornings when time seems to stand still. The kind of early morning when silence feels deeper and shadows appear heavier, thicker. We were traveling on a lonely road, my family and I heading home after visiting some relatives. Sleep and fatigue mixed with the monotony of the journey. Suddenly, we felt a sharp blow and a very loud noise. One of the car's rear tires had blown out. My dad stopped as soon as he found a safe enough spot on the side of the road and got out to inspect the damage. After a few minutes, he decided he would have to walk to the nearest tire shop, which, according to him, shouldn't be too far away. We had just passed a town a few kilometers back. My mom, grandmother, and I stayed in the car, patiently waiting for his return. Darkness enveloped us, and the only sound was the occasional whisper of wind passing through the nearby trees. A few minutes passed in silence, in absolute silence. Suddenly, my grandmother began to grow restless. "Don't you hear that?" she asked with a trembling voice. "Hear what, Mom?" my mother responded, trying to stay calm. "Screams, honey. There are many people screaming," my grandmother insisted, her eyes filling with terror. We tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just her imagination and nothing more. The adrenaline from the shock of the flat tire was just starting to affect her, but she wouldn't stop pointing into the darkness, insisting that the screams were real, that they were very close. The screams, she said, were heart-wrenching, full of desperation and suffering. "There's no one there, Grandma. It's just us." "Believe me," I said, though I wasn't so sure of my words. Her panic was starting to affect me. After a while, we managed to calm her down, and she finally fell asleep, muttering in her dreams. My mom and I exchanged nervous glances, trying to stay calm while waiting for my father's return. And hours passed. Hours passed very slowly, and the fear of the unknown, of not knowing what was out there, grew with each minute. Finally, almost at dawn, we saw my dad's figure approaching on the road, accompanied by a man rolling a tire. I felt immense relief seeing him. They started working on the car, and in no time the tire was ready, and we were prepared to continue our journey. As we were about to leave, I looked around carefully for the first time. The dawn light began to illuminate the landscape, revealing what the darkness, what the night had hidden from us. My heart started racing, like I don't remember it ever doing before. When I realized that we had been parked all that time next to an old cemetery, one of those that gets lost in the earth, that are forgotten. The tombstones were aligned in irregular rows, some so old that the names could barely be read. I then remembered the screams my grandmother had mentioned. Before I could react, before I could say anything, I heard my mother's nervous voice. "Let's go now, please. I want to leave this place. I want to get home," she said, also noticing the cemetery and feeling quite uncomfortable. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look out the rear window, expecting to see something or someone, but I only saw the silent, mysterious tombs in the dawn light. The experience was etched in my mind, and although we never spoke of it again, I couldn't stop thinking about the screams my grandmother said she had heard, and the souls that perhaps accompanied us during that unsettling night at the edge of the cemetery. After that night on the road, life returned to normal, or at least we tried to make it so. But something had changed in us, especially in me. I couldn't stop thinking about the screams my grandmother had mentioned, about what she had said, and the fact that we had been parked next to a graveyard. That incident marked a before and after, an echo of something sinister that I couldn't fully comprehend. However, what was a night of terror, a terrible but isolated night, or so we wanted to think, ended up making sense of another constant complaint from my grandmother. You see, she once went to a low-budget nursing home. For as long as I can remember, she always talked about the screams she heard coming from the nursing home. She said the elderly were mistreated by the staff, that she could hear it, that their laments haunted her every night. She made us swear that we would never put her in a place like that. My mom and I thought that maybe her mind was playing tricks on her due to loneliness, age, or that maybe she wanted to convince us how bad places like that were, so we would never take her to a nursing home. This place was finally reported and shut down after an investigation revealed the horrible abuses committed there. The elderly were relocated, and the place was left empty, abandoned to its fate, to time. However, my grandmother kept insisting that she heard the screams every night, begging us to do something about it. "I just can't bear those screams," she would tell us desperately. "You have to do something, please. You have to silence them." We tried to calm her down, explaining over and over again that the nursing home was now empty, that there was no one there anymore, but she didn't seem to understand. Or perhaps she couldn't accept it. The screams she said she heard tormented her until the day she died. After her funeral, I began to reflect on what I had experienced and what my grandmother had gone through. The screams she heard in the cemetery that night seemed to resonate with an unsettling familiarity. Could those screams be a paranormal manifestation, similar to those she heard from the nursing home? A day later, I decided to return to my grandmother's house. I needed to find answers, or at least better understand what she had lived through. The house was empty and silent. An echo of her presence was all that inhabited every corner. I approached the closed nursing home, whose windows and doors were boarded up, and the air had a sense of abandonment, of desolation. That night I stayed at my grandmother's house, determined to hear for myself if there was anything coming from there. At midnight, the silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the occasional creaking of the house. Suddenly, a distant sound made me shudder. They were screams, faint and muffled, but unmistakable. They were screams coming from the nursing home. Very nervous, I slowly approached the window that faced it. The building stood like a dark shadow, like a black darker than the night. The screams, muffled, but continued mixing with the wind that whispered among the trees. I felt dizzy, perhaps from the fright, from the fear. But I couldn't understand it. It couldn't be real. The place was empty, wasn't it? The screams ceased as suddenly as they had come, leaving me in an even deeper silence. I wondered if I had imagined it all, if my mind was playing tricks on me. but the fear I felt was too real to be a mere illusion. The next day I left my grandmother's house, but the screams kept resonating in my mind. I realized that perhaps those laments were more than just sounds, that maybe they were echoes of trapped souls, somehow seeking to release their suffering. I couldn't help but wonder if the screams my grandmother heard in the nursing home and those I had heard in the cemetery were manifestations of the same phenomenon, a hidden reality to our eyes, but palpable in the air. I never talked about this with anyone. I kept the experience just for myself. But every time I pass by a cemetery or an abandoned building, I can't help but listen, hoping to catch those screams that remind me that there are things in this world that escape our understanding. Things that, although we cannot see, are there, waiting to be heard, waiting for you to hear them. A while ago, my Uncle Paul and I came across an accident on the highway, returning to Uruapan, Michoacan. It was a sunny afternoon when we saw an overturned van on the curve. Several motorists stopped to help. The accident victims were field workers, and the crash had left some severely injured. While waiting for emergency services to arrive, we helped everyone as best we could. Finally, when several ambulances arrived, they told us we could leave, that it was for the best. That night, however, I started feeling unwell. My mom told me it was probably due to the shock, but I knew it was something more, like I could feel it. And that night, I couldn't stop dreaming about a boy standing next to my bed. The dream kept repeating over and over. The boy looked around confused. He had dark, sad eyes that stayed with me, that I felt accompanied me even when I woke up. Days passed, and my health improved, but the dream kept recurring. I always woke up tired, feeling like I hadn't rested at all. And one night, while we were having dinner, my mom mentioned something that left me cold. "You know, son," she said, "today I heard a boy playing in your room when you weren't there. The house was empty, and when I went in to check, there was no one." I began to confirm that something wasn't right. It wasn't possible for there to be a boy in my room. The next day, my little sister told me she had seen a boy standing in the yard in the afternoon, while I wasn't there, and while my mom had gone to the supermarket. I asked her to describe him, and her description left me breathless. It was the same boy from my dreams. When we told her, frightened, my mom decided to call a lady known in the neighborhood who did cleansings and that sort of thing. In Michoacan, there's no shortage of people who do that. The lady came to the house with herbs and candles, and after a series of rituals, she assured us that everything would be fine. The dream ceased, and we never saw the boy again. However, sometime later, by pure chance, we found a note on Facebook that my sister shared with me. The note described an accident that had occurred on the same curve where my Uncle Paul and I had seen that first rollover. The note mentioned that in the previous accident, the one we went to, there had only been one fatality: a child. At that moment, everything fell into place. I understood that the boy from my dreams, the boy from the apparitions, could be him. Maybe by stopping on the highway, somehow we had brought him with us. Or maybe he was just seeking help to find rest, to find the way there. Whatever it was, it still gives me chills to remember his lost gaze, the sound of his steps in the empty room. Every time I pass by that curve on the highway to Uruapan, I can't help but think about the boy and how, even in death, some spirits don't find peace. Before continuing with our next story, we want to take a moment to thank you for accompanying us on this journey through the unknown. Your support helps us continue exploring the mysteries that excite us all so much around here. But now get ready, because the last story of this night will take you to a terrifying place where fear feels closer than ever. Don't go away, because the best is yet to come. There's one more story left tonight. Upon arriving from the airport, I went straight to the hotel reception and asked for my room. The girl at the reception, with a kind but somewhat nervous smile, told me that I needed to wait an hour for it to be cleaned. I then asked for another, any that was available, because I really just wanted to rest. I also had a terrible headache that wouldn't leave me alone, since I had boarded the plane several hours earlier. After much insistence, I convinced her to give me one on the second floor. She seemed to hesitate, but finally agreed, and handed me the key. I went up with my luggage, and as soon as I entered the room, I noticed that the curtain was open, and my window faced another window of a room in a tower across from mine. Just a couple of meters away, at the back of that window, at the back of that room, I saw a woman smiling at me from inside, behind the partially open curtains. It seemed strange to me, but I greeted her with a slight nod of my head and went to take a shower. I was really exhausted, and all I wanted was to relax. When I came out of the bathroom, I realized that the woman was still there, smiling, looking into my room. Now closer, now almost pressed against her window. I felt a chill down my spine. Now that I looked at her carefully, that woman had a very strange paleness. A certain disturbing aspect that didn't leave me at ease. I tried to ignore her, thinking that maybe she was just a curious guest, or perhaps someone from work I should know but didn't recognize. I lay down on the bed and tried to sleep. Just as I was starting to fall asleep, I felt a presence. I felt someone very close. Something made me turn towards the window. I opened the curtain, and there she was, with her forehead pressed against the glass of her window, looking at me very, very intently. The paleness she had, now I can say, was completely disturbing. Her smile was very strange. It was obvious that she was a woman with some kind of psychiatric disorder, or at least that's what it made me think. Her eyes said nothing. Her eyes seemed to have no life. I couldn't stand it. I closed the curtain abruptly and called reception, asking for another room. Any room. The girl now told me in a more serious voice that the only room available was the one they had originally prepared for me, that it would be ready in about 20 minutes, and that if I wanted to reserve it, I had to go to reception right away to wait. I quickly gathered my things, trying not to look at the window again, and ran down to reception. The girl looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy and something else, perhaps understanding. When I arrived, she said, "I knew you wouldn't take long to come back." I asked her what she meant, if she knew about the woman across from my room. She replied that across from that room, the only thing there was a warehouse that was always closed, that there was no woman, but that this apparition is the reason why they try never to rent out that room. At that moment, I felt like my soul left my body. I didn't know what to say. The girl handed me the key to the new room, and I went up, still in shock. That night, I couldn't sleep well, thinking about that woman in the window. I tried to focus on the preparations for the convention, reviewing my notes and making sure I had everything in order. But my mind kept going back to those empty eyes and that chilling smile. The next day, during the convention, I felt exhausted, distracted. None of my colleagues knew what I had been through. But every time they asked me if I had rested well, I could only think of those empty eyes, that disturbing smile. I tried to focus on the presentations and meetings, but a part of me remained alert, expecting to see that spectral figure, that woman in any corner or passing in front of the window. That night, back at the hotel, I made sure to close all the curtains and keep the lights on. The fear of seeing that woman in the window again kept me from sleeping. It kept me on edge all night. Even the smallest sound made me startle. Finally, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell asleep, although my sleep was light and disturbed by nightmares. Since then, every time I book a hotel, I make sure to request a room far from any window that faces another room or another tower. I don't want to experience something like that ever again. Never, ever again. I still wonder, who was that woman? What did she want? Although logic tells me it had nothing to do with a ghost in that hotel, that it was just a misunderstanding or a trick of my mind. A part of me cannot, and I think will never be able to forget the cold reality of that gaze.